Sharing your passion starts with taking that first step. Take Will, for example. His first step was taking free TV classes at CCX Create. He's learning production skills and now has access to cutting-edge equipment. He's working on local music productions, meeting new people, and gaining the experience needed to produce his own show. Best of all, he's sharing his passion for music with others in the community. Share your passion. Visit ccxmedia.org.
Welcome to Bookbeat and the second episode of The Ford Century in Minnesota by Brian McMahon. We rejoin our conversation learning about the effects of the Great Depression and World War II on the Ford Motor Company. We further learn about the changing industrial landscape that led to the closure. We conclude with a review of industrial and architectural history with Rose Ryan, librarian at the Hennepin County Library, Maple Grove. How did Ford weather the Great Depression?
Ford was such a messianic individual that he believed that he could change the world. I mean, he always had that belief, and he felt that he saw everybody else pulling the plug on manufacturing and scaling things back and shutting things down. In his kind of simple way, he realized what we needed was not a retrenchment, we needed stimulation. He actually increased production, increased wages, and tried to single-handedly boost the economy. The problem was he was the Lone Ranger and nobody else did it, so it didn't work. And he had to shut down for a couple of years. He did. He had to shut the whole thing down. The Twin Cities plant, the whole operation shut down, 33 to 35. So his workers, of course, were thrown out of work and before the union, no benefits, no health care. FDR was coming in, trying to bring in the New Deal program and the safety net, and he did. Sadly, Henry Ford found himself in opposition, and really he became the face of the opponents of the New Deal program. By then, Henry Ford had changed. By then, he had gone kind of through another stage of his character and his thinking. He had really lost a lot of the benevolence towards the workers that he had had in the early days. And he really had a great deal of animosity. There was a lot of labor turmoil.
That was another question that I had for you.
Yeah, the workers were trying to organize the car companies, and it was bloody because they were totally opposed to it. It was not an easy job for the auto workers. The companies drove them very hard. Ford was the worst. After a lot of bloody organizing campaigns with deaths and a lot of physical turmoil, GM, the other two major car companies, General Motors and Chrysler, did organize with the United Auto Workers, which really got going in 1937. Ford said it would be over his dead body that he would ever accept the union. And that was always a belief from the earliest days, so he was always opposed to unions. But you know, we've now got kind of the political tide going in the other direction. FDR is pushing for support of the workers and certainly the organized labor movements. We've got the rumblings of war in Europe, and it seems inevitable. By 1940, the draft is instituted. We've got the ending of automaking in the country. We're not at war. We're still a year and a half away from the declaration of war, but we have been mobilized, and slowly but surely, inevitably, the federal government started to restrict the production of automobiles to get the industrial capacity towards production of military equipment.
Okay.
And so it's clear that the Ford Motor Company's got nowhere to go unless they started to work with FDR and the federal government. And then they're still not organized as, with an agreement with the United Auto Workers. Well, it kind of all came together in 1941. We're getting very close to war, which was December, but earlier in the year, Ford had been challenging the National Labor Relations Board. He single-handedly was fighting FDR tooth and nail, brought a couple of major lawsuits. He was losing every one of them before the Supreme Court. Finally, it was like he was in total violation of the law, and FDR basically had no choice but to declare that if Ford didn't accept these programs, he was going to take over the Ford Motor Company.
Going to nationalize it.
Nationalize it. At that point, and Ford would have said, take it. He's not even going to fight it. But his wife, Clara, his lifelong companion, who was always the true believer, felt that she wanted to save the company for their son, Etzel. And she issued an ultimatum to her husband, Henry. Either you accept the United Auto Workers and the requirements of the federal government, or I will leave you.
Oh, boy.
Serious stuff.
Yeah, I
and
guess
Henry
so.
Ford had no choice at that point but to do that. So he accepted the United Auto Workers, and interestingly, he ended up giving them the most generous contract that they had ever negotiated. He basically is kind of an old man, beginning to turn senile, gave it up. So the UAW came in. Their first task was not to protect the workers to make cars, but to find jobs for the workers since the car production was being shut down. We're now on the eve of war, still a few months away, and everybody was scrambling to get military contracts. In fact, Ford Motor Company had actually already had several major auto military contracts for the Pratt & Whitney Airport, Pratt & Whitney aviation engine, even before the Union came in. So we're starting now to get into military production. Cars stopped 41, and the Twin Cities assembly plant ended up getting 2 large contracts. Well, Ford did nationally, and he assigned 2 chunks of this to the local St. Paul operation. First one was airplane engine parts for the Pratt & Whitney engine, which was basically the principal engine for most of the fighter planes used during World War II, the American fighter planes. And so they carved up the plant into 2 halves, and on the east half, they built what was known as the M8 armored car. So it was a tank on wheels, and they did a lot of manufacturing here of the component parts. It was not just assembly. They actually welded things and put it all together.
Okay.
And it was on the back half of the plant that they constructed an oval test track. And so they made about 5,000-6,000 of these tanks on wheels that they tested out in the back track. And some great stories there. They had a woman test driver who actually flipped one of these tanks because she felt she was being pressured to speed it up, and she hit the curb and flipped it over, and there was a lot of great scuttlebutt, if you will.
Oh, my goodness.
But on the other half, the aviation half, that was not quite so heavy industrial fabrication and what have you. It was more assembly of parts, and there they ended up hiring a lot of women workers.
That was my next question.
Yep.
How did women figure into the employment of Ford during the war?
Well,
after?
you know, most times a woman wouldn't be interested in working in industry and wouldn't have found a willing place to work in industry. You know, most men would have assumed that it was their livelihood and they were important for them to be working there, and they didn't want to be jeopardized, if you will, by woman employment. All the men are off to war. We have a huge labor shortage. There was really no choice but for women to come in, the Rosie the Riveter, and they did. And 70-80% of the workers making the airplane engine parts were women. And there's some great pictures great stories. I interviewed several of the women who worked there. They did their part. And both operations, the tanks and the airplane engine parts, were very successful. We did our share. America's greatest generation, the men and the women. And come the end of the war, the soldiers had a right legally to come back and resume their employment where they left it.
Mm-hmm.
They had a union deal where they could have kept seniority in their union for all the time that they were off to war.
Mm-hmm.
The women were also members of the United Auto Workers Local 879, but of course they were the last in line as far as seniority.
Mm-hmm.
So here comes the returning soldiers. During the war, there were over 3,000 people working at the plant, which was really the high point.
Mm-hmm.
After the war, they're talking a production of probably needing 1,800 workers. That's a lot of people now playing musical chairs.
Mm-hmm.
The men don't want to have any part of the woman taking their jobs. There's just a whole cultural shift where women who had been such an invaluable part of the war effort were now being pressured, if you will, to go back to domestic life.
Mm-hmm.
Go back to the kitchen.
And that didn't last too long.
Well,
another
there was
20 years.
Yeah, before a woman finally got back. But let me tell you that process of displacing the woman, well, most of them left and were happy. They got out, they did their part, happy to go home to their families and all the above. But there were a handful who weren't going to leave under any circumstance. Mm-hmm. They said, "You're going to carry me out of here." And it was very, very ugly. The tension between the men who wanted the woman out to an all-male workforce and the labor union, which basically backed up the men and was not supportive to the woman. Some very painful stories, but also some amazing stories of resilience about how these women would not let go. For them, it was not a political statement or an ideological statement. There was one woman who was widowed. Just before she started, her husband died, and she had kids. There was no other place really that would have allowed her to make the living that she could have at the Ford plant. So what she went through was really a very tough road after that. Yeah.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah.
I've got a couple more questions here. You talked pretty much about the rise of the United Auto Workers. When was their peak?
In the 1950s,
Really?
30% of the workforce in America was organized into labor unions.
Yeah.
So after FDR made the push, the workers, of course, made the pull. This was very, very difficult times in this country. A lot of labor wars. People were killed at the Ford Motor Company, organizing principally in Detroit. You know, you'd lose your job. If you were union agitator, you would lose your job. If you marched against the company, you could get shot. I mean, and this was at a time when you didn't have the unemployment benefits and the health benefits and all the other safety nets. So there were some serious sacrifices to be made. Today, we're talking single digits of the workforce being organized into labor unions. So, so there were big labor unions, big companies, big profits. We were making 80% of the cars in the world. Life was good. Life was good. Everybody shared in the prosperity.
Right. With the demise, there's a couple of questions that I have regarding that. What did the effect of robotics coming in have on the Ford plant?
Well, it was a gradual thing. This was after, of course, Henry Ford passed away. We're talking in the 50s, 60s. And robotics is now thought of as an all-encompassing term, but really the preliminary step is known as automation, where things are fixed. there's a manufacturing process where a machine does something, but it's not a smart machine. It can't be programmed. It's just turning something over and over again. A robot, on the other hand, has got a bit of a memory and an instructional capacity that you can have it do this, turn the bolt, and then do something else, and do 10 other things, and you can keep changing it.
Yeah.
Now, in the 60s, we've always had a very highly motivated, highly skilled workforce here. And there were some really talented machine makers, tool and die makers at the Ford plants. And, you know, they had an interest in and a willingness to help come up with better ways to produce. So they would come up with machine tools or little gizmos and contraptions that made a job easier.
But in the ultimate, it removed jobs.
Well, it did. It did. In the later 60s, the UAW could see the writing on the wall. I mean, well, actually, labor throughout history was always fearful that automation would eliminate jobs. And this was happening in a huge way. And Ford had instituted what's known as the suggestion program, which paid workers for suggestions on improving how something was made or the quality of the product or of the plant. And they fought it tooth and nail because every suggestion that was introduced, well, the whole point of the suggestion program was to save jobs, or to save for the company to eliminate jobs, to save the work from the company's perspective, or to save money. So there's no question. And we're talking massive reorienting of the workforce. I mean, one guy came in with a suggestion that was introduced company-wide and was responsible for putting tens of thousands of workers out of their job.
Oh my goodness.
So this was very significant. But on the flip side, you could argue that, well, the machines, what they did is they tended to do the heavy lifting, the dangerous work, the unpleasant work, and so you could argue that that's a benefit to the workers, not having to lift. I mean, at this point, that made it easier for women to join the workforce because brute strength was not a main requirement. And as you got into more sophisticated robotics and automation, it also kind of changed the dynamic a little bit. Instead of the workers just being stuck on the line, putting on the bolt, you had to train workers to operate the machines. So there was a trade-off. You might not have quite as many jobs, but the jobs required more skill. And that kind of shifted the dynamic a little bit to the benefit of the worker side, which is smarter workers were needed, and you needed to offer the workers a little bit more in the way of education and other benefits to keep them going. So there was kind of an equilibrium there. So I would not say that robotics or automation was the principal reason why production stopped at the St. Paul plant in 2011.
Okay.
But it was an issue. But the principal reason was that in the late 70s or so, Ford and other national industrial companies started to move production overseas. Principally to Mexico, where labor costs would be a pittance of what they are here. And they would save on production costs there. But the other benefit, truth be told, is that it became a negotiating leverage point with the United Auto Workers to essentially say, if you want to keep working in this plant, you got to drive your wages down so you can compete with the auto workers in Mexico. And that's what happened. And wages were driven down, benefits were driven down, working conditions were made worse. The work week got longer. You know, Henry Ford introduced the 8-hour day, 40-hour week, By the time the plant closed, they had gone through extended, we're talking years, where they had mandatory overtime, bringing them up to 52, 53 hours a week.
Oh, my goodness.
Okay, so picture yourself turning that bolt, 5 10-hour days, 58 hours, 5 10s, and 8 hours on Saturday. 58 hours a week.
Oh, my goodness.
I mean, this is unconscionable. We're talking in the 1980s and 90s.
Okay.
So it was basically round 2 of the labor wars. But by now, organized labor didn't have the friend in the White House. Ronald Reagan had just shut down the PATCO strikers on the West Coast. The tide had turned. It was a rout. Organized labor was
Gutted.
And when the plant closed, there were 3 tiers of workers, something that the United Auto Workers said they would never tolerate.
Right.
So you had the legacy workers making one amount. They had a next group coming in who made 60% of that. And the third group, all working side by side, turning the same bolts, if you will. One group making $15 an hour and the other group making, side by side, $50 an hour. It was gruesome for the workers. But the company had all the leverage. The bad economic times, it was a take it or leave it deal. If you don't like it, we shut the plant down.
Yeah, and that was the constant threat from the
Always.
beginning.
Always from the very beginning, that is correct.
Okay, we need to move on.
Sure.
My question, final question is, what is the future of that site?
Well, when Henry Ford discovered it, walked around it, it was described as really one of the most beautiful parcels of land anywhere. On a bluff, overlooking the majestic Mississippi River, undeveloped, and it's pretty much back to where we began. This whole story, the 4th century, has come full circle in so many different ways. Among them, that site of land has now been stripped clear. The building is gone. Parking lots are gone. The slabs are pulled up. They're doing their environmental testing, the remediation. And they want to return it to the opportunities for brand new development, just as though there was nothing ever there.
Oh my goodness.
The only thing that's left is that kind of the last minute, we managed to get the company to preserve some elements of the original beautiful Albert Kahn design classical facade in the hope that they could be reconstructed, re-put together at some point, either in the development or somewhere else. And they are now stored in about 8 different metal cargo containers on the site. So,
oh my goodness.
So we don't know what's going to happen to those, or we don't know what's going to happen on the site, but the city of St. Paul has been working very hard since 2011, so it's been 5-6 years already, to generate a lot of community support on how the site should be developed. And it's a great challenge, but it's also, by virtually all accounts, one of the best development parcels of 200 acres in the country.
Oh my goodness. Well, we need to wrap this up today.
Okay.
I'm not even going to ask you if you have anything to add because we'll be going for another hour.
Oh yeah, you got that right. Yeah.
It's been such a pleasure.
Thank you.
To hear your story and to hear your process of putting together this book, The Ford Century in Minnesota.
Thank you.
This is the end of Book Beat for today. We thank Brian McMahon for being our guest today, and we look forward to seeing you again next time.
Volunteering is more than just a word. It's a window to opportunities. Take Mark, for example. By taking free TV classes at CCX Create, Mark is helping bring entertainment and information to his community, along with building a foundation of skills that will take him one step closer to his dreams. Share your passion. Visit ccxmedia.org.
Welcome back to BookBeat. My name is Sue Ellen Zagrabelny and I'm your host. Today we are at the Hennepin County Library, Maple Grove, looking at a vast array of books about local history, industrial history, and architectural history. One of the books that we have in the collection that we've gathered here is called Land of Amber Water, The History of Brewing in Minnesota, by a man named Doug Hoverson. A food critic named Jeremy Eggers said this about Land of Amber Waters. History buffs and beer lovers alike will find much to enjoy in Doug Hoverson's authoritative Land of Amber Waters. Hoverson brings to life Minnesota's brewing past and tells stories of the new generation of craft brewers who are shaping its future. The AIA has published under the Minnesota Historical Society Press 4 guides to Twin Cities landmarks. Its author, Larry Millett, is cited as an unmatched observer and chronicler of rich architectural diversity in the Twin Cities. This is by Richard Moe, president of the National Trust for Historic Preservation. The Minnesota Historical Society Press published a book called Minnesota Treasures, Stories Behind the State's Historic Places. It's been described as a sumptuous collection of stories and personalities behind 75 Minnesota properties from the National Register of Historic Places. The author is Dennis P. Gardner. The foreword is by Richard Moe, president of the National Trust for Historic Preservation. Moe goes on to say, these places help us understand who we are. They constitute a unique family portrait for us. And what a colorful, complex, endlessly fascinating portrait it is. Just as we learn about our fathers and mothers, who they were, what they believed, how they lived, from buildings they left us. Our children will learn about us the very same way. Welcome back to Book Beat. I'm Sue Ellen Zagrabelny, your host. Today we are discussing industrial history, local history, and architectural history. Our guest is Rose Ryan from the Hennepin County Library, Maple Grove. And welcome, Rose.
Oh, thank you for having me.
Today we have spent some time looking at books about architecture, but is there a way to look at any subject and have a strategy how to look things up, how to build a body of information about that subject?
Sure. So you're in a library and you're looking for information about a topic. The first thing to do would be to use our catalog to rule in or rule out what physical books or even an ebook we might have that would nail the topic that you're talking about, be right on, give you the information that you wanted to. Nowadays, of course, there's online access as well. So you could use Google or use the internet to try to find what you're looking for. So more importantly, there'd be online access to databases. So databases are searchable. Some are, a very few of them are only accessed when you're in the library. Many of them are accessed outside the library. You would need a library card to enter to authenticate yourself as a user, but you can use them outside of the library. And to determine which databases are best for your topic, we do have a category search for our databases, but they are, if you read a little bit about them, because we describe the databases, then you can pick which ones you want and input search terms, and then, again, determine whether or not the information you get is what you want or not as you go deeper into your research. Of course, there's always periodicals, and periodicals, for the most part, are available online nowadays for full text. So you always want to think about your research in terms of subject. What are the keywords that will help you develop and get the information out? Or if you know authors that are authoritative about the topic that you're interested in, or even if you come armed with titles already. So those are kind of the way we attack research is, especially if you're in a library, rule in or rule out physical books, and then look at your internet or online databases, and then also periodicals, which for the most part are online but can also be in print.
Okay, let's hone in on our subject today of looking at local history, industrial history, and architectural history in relation to our book, The Fourth Century in Minnesota. Earlier in our episode, we spoke with the author, Brian McMahon, and his book led us to talking about architectural history because the Ford plant in St. Paul was such a model of modern architecture. So how would we go about looking at, you had some things that we talked about off camera. Walk me through how you would
Sure.
look at this kind of topic.
Sure. Well, when you talk to me about industrial architecture and specifically the Ford plant, I grew up not far away from the Ford plant in Minnesota, or in St. Paul, excuse me. And in fact, my sister used to work in the cafeteria years ago in the 1960s, 70s. So anyway, it was of interest to me. But in particular, I was inspired by a exhibit that the Minnesota Historical Society did not too long ago about how to research not just locations of businesses, past, but also residential homes. And so that would tie in, people who are interested in genealogy, etc. But if we could just be looking at how to research a business location and use the Ford plant as an example, I just have some interesting things and a way to process through finding that research as well. Before I forget to mention it though, if you A lot of the historical information we have is housed at the downtown Minneapolis Central Library. And if you have difficulty getting to the Central Library, there is a process called document delivery for items that can be scanned and emailed, and also interlibrary loan, which would give you access to resources in libraries held throughout Minnesota. We can go even beyond Minnesota, but many of the items that people need can be found in Minnesota. Also reference books that are at the downtown Minneapolis Library are called reference books because they are used at the downtown library. So that's a really good reason to try to get there, to look at some of the things that can't actually physically leave the premises. There's accommodations made for people because the Hennepin County Library is a big system, 41 libraries, and we can move things around. So I always encourage people who are listening to us today to ask, and especially ask at the downtown library too, for assistance for all their rich resources.
Okay. Let's walk through what you found about the Ford plant and how you go about doing this.
Sure. So starting at our website, www.hclib.org, there is a menu at the top, or a navigational tab, where you have a menu that drops down, and it's called Programs and Services. One of the options under the menu that drops down is Genealogy and Local History. So with that in mind, there's the library outlines how to start your research. So there's a tab of online resources for local history, access to maps, access to city old Minneapolis directories. And as I say this, so the emphasis is definitely on Minneapolis businesses, and residences. But you would apply this same type of research to see if, St. Paul Library has access to old directories. Minnesota Historical Society can help you. And with the main Ford plant being in St. Paul, of course, that will be a factor. There was Ford plants in Minneapolis, so we'll have some examples to show you from Minneapolis.
Okay.
Again, back to our website, www.hclib.org. There is also, under that same tab, the Genealogy and Local History, there's also an access point to the Minneapolis History Collection. So that both of those come into play, because when you click on the Minneapolis History Collection, there's a nice guide that opens up online that is called Researching Homes, Buildings, and Neighborhoods in Minneapolis.
Oh wow,
Yeah.
that's spectacular.
Yeah. It's a full page of links, so it is dependent upon use on your computer, but you can always come into a library to use the computer as well. So one of the first things you'll encounter is, once you're armed with the address of the old business location, and if you don't have that, then there's an option to be looking in the Minneapolis directories that are old, that are online, to kind of, you can search by a keyword or the name of the company you're looking for, and then hopefully resurrect that address. But if you are already armed with that, then there are old permit cards that are digitized. They are to a certain year. Let's see, building permit records are from 1884 to 1972, and then after that, a computerized system was started, and so those are now accessed in a different way. The library doesn't have access to those. You'd have to get those through the city's development review office. But again, if I can refer back to this Researching Homes, Buildings, and Neighborhoods in Minneapolis web page that we had, it would mention that.
And there'd be a link to that, right?
Well, that,
or do you have to call the city hall and
you have to go in person.
Oh, you have to go in
person for the ones that happened after 1972 or thereabouts.
Okay.
But these very old ones are digitized.
Okay.
And armed with the address or the name of the company, you can search. And there is an example of first the access to the directory, and how I actually did find the address to the Minneapolis Ford Motor Company plant.
Okay.
And it was listed in the directory as 412 through 28, 5th Street North. So with that information, I could look up the permit card. And there's just an example. The permit cards are, I would say, hard to read. There's a PDF inserted in that same web page that directs you through the research process of how to read these permit cards. And I've just inserted an example of some of the coding that they use. They use letters to indicate what kind of construction was done. Okay. So then we actually found a permit card for the Minneapolis plant, and it indicates, you know, different electricity that was done and additions that were made and elevators that were repaired, etc. Then beyond the permits, you can look at census data. So following the web page, it would direct you to census data, but census data now is really used for the residential homes to say who lived in what residential, you know, dwelling when.
Okay.
So there's also Plat Books that are available, architectural plans, and the more well-known your building or businesses that you're researching, the more likely it is that you can find that information. So, but it's all a process of weeding out, you know, or I should say, narrowing your search to find if you have it or not. Okay.
Yes.
So also there's photographs that are available now. Many of these are, I would say, browsable digital collections, or where, let's see. The Minnesota State Historical Society has some on their website, and they're not necessary. They can be searched by keyword, you know, versus browsing or keywords. So some are keyword searchable. Hennepin History Museum has photographs, but they are not digital. You'd have to go there in person.
Okay.
And all of that would be, you know, not under the purview of Hennepin County Library. So I encourage people, if they do find that they're doing that deep research, to actually contact those institutions to find out how it works.
Okay, that makes good sense.
Yeah.
But the thing that we want to emphasize is that the library is your main resource. It's like your
starting point,
clearinghouse,
Yeah.
starting point, and from there you can branch out.
Sure. So newspaper clippings is a really good example. So we have access to the Minneapolis Tribune, the historical part. So, you know, I just put in some keywords of Ford Motor Company, and I came up with a nice article that was entitled, the headline is "From Detroit to Minneapolis in Oakland in 6." And it talks about Henry Ford celebrating his 50th birthday. So it was kind of fun to read about it. And there also would be periodicals that are also archival or historical.
Okay.
So I did mention about the photographs, and I also had, nothing was in the database that the Central Library has, the special collections, per se about the building, but there was something about the salespeople of the Ford Motor Company dating back. So I also show an example of that.
Okay, we'll be looking at that in a while.
Yeah. So if you're lucky enough, like I said, to be researching or any type of research where you know it's famous and it's well known and lots of information should be out there, then an example of architecture would be like Cass Gilbert buildings or Clarence Johnson, and there are papers of the architects that are available.
Okay.
Okay, so it is interesting to just think about topics in that manner, like, you know, rule in or out books, you know, move a little broader to databases because they may be ease of access, you know, convenient if you're not at a library, and broader still, you know, to just an internet website, but you may find an expert on your topic, and then to look at magazines always. And again, they can be in print or online.
Is there anything else you'd like to add about our topic today?
Well, in this particular, industrial architecture, you're looking at historical information, you would want to see what the Historical Society has, what the Hennepin History Museum has. You could be missing a very interesting part of history about the building or company or business that you're researching. I did run across that in the Borchert Map Library, that they have historical area photographs online. So that's just an example, and there was one of where the Ford plant is located on the Mississippi River. And it would just, if nothing else, if you're just thoroughly passionate about your subject, it's kind of fun to see this.
Yes, and the idea that you can go in so deeply and look so broadly.
Yes.
So,
and to keep looking for research, ask librarians. One document can lead to another document, to another document, and there are rich resources that I find out about all the time, and I am a librarian. So,
yes. So the emphasis is on that we continue to learn, and
very much so.
And you never know where it's going to lead you.
Right.
Rose Ryan, thank you for taking the time to speak with us today. Thank you for joining us at BookBeat today. We look forward to seeing you again soon.
Volunteering is more than just a word. It's a window to opportunities. Take Mark, for example. By taking free TV classes at CCX Create, Mark is helping bring entertainment and information to his community, along with building a foundation of skills that will take him one step closer to his dreams. Share your passion. Visit ccxmedia.org.